All right, everyone, if you'd please make your way to your seats. We're going to start this session, and we're going to close the doors. All right, everyone. Well, for the final session for today, I think we have a particularly intriguing one. Needless to say, this is the 10th anniversary year of 9/11, and so it seemed to me appropriate to spend at least one panel that would focus exclusively. Of course, many of the panels have focused on this in passing to one degree or another, but to focus exclusively on events leading up to 9/11 and the immediate aftermath to 9/11. What could have been done that might have prevented the attacks, if anything? The response to 9/11, was it as swift as it should have been? Were there mistakes that were made that could have put us in a better place today with regard to the war on terror? The panel will explore all of these issues, and I'll introduce the moderator in a second. But before I do that, just one quick administrative word. One of our sponsors, I2, has graciously agreed this year to underwrite a dinner for speakers and moderators and their spouses, partners, significant others, and Jane Harmon has graciously agreed to host that dinner at her house here in Aspen. So immediately following this panel at 7, there will be shuttle buses taking speakers and moderators to the Harmon house, just right outside as you exit the left. And for the return, they will return to Aspen Meadows here for those of you who are staying on campus, and for those of you who are staying in town, there will be a stop in town for those who are staying there. And of course, everything in Aspen is within walking distance, as you know. So with that administrative matter out of the way, and having set the scene for what the panel is about, let me introduce the moderator. The moderator is Catherine Herridge, who is an award-winning correspondent for Fox News, covering Homeland Security and justice issues. Catherine began her journalism career at ABC News in London, where she was a radio correspondent, and then she went to Fox thereafter, and as I say, since 2001, appropriately enough, she has been covering Homeland Security issues. And I want to put in a particular plug for Catherine's new book. I was at a book talk she gave just last week in Washington that was hosted by my counterpart and friend Ozzie Nelson at CSIS. She's written a terrific new book called The Next Wave. That's the first book, actually, but her new book is called The Secrets of 9/11, and it's in particular about whether Anwar al-Awlaki might have played a role in 9/11. The Next Wave, it's called, and the book is available right outside, and I hope that you will buy it, and I hope that you will read it. It's very interesting indeed, and I think it will be the subject of much conversation in Washington as the weeks go by. So with that, Catherine.
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone. Thank you, Clark, for that very kind introduction. And I have to say already people are talking about coming back next year. That's how successful the forum has been. So, Clark, thank you for your hard work and for your thoughtful preparation of these panels. Also, Walter Isaacson, thank you for giving me the honor and the privilege of moderating what I think is one of the central panels here, because you can't really have a better future until you learn from the past. Just for full disclosure, I'm in a military family, so my reporting in this area is very personal. And my husband was in Afghanistan for about 9 months in 2009. And he often says to me, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire. And sometimes there's just a raging inferno, which is kind of what the intelligence looked like leading up to 9/11. So I'd like to just take a moment here and introduce the panel, because our job is to take you back a decade and to look at the intelligence again and ask that very basic question, whether the attacks could have been prevented. The panel includes, really needs no introduction, but for those who are not familiar with them, let me do that. Richard Ben-Veniste, a former 9/11 commissioner. Also Barbara Sude, a senior political scientist, RAND Corporation, and a former senior al-Qaeda analyst at the National Counter-Terrorism Center. Also Gary Berntsen, former commander Central Intelligence Agency forces in eastern Afghanistan, and Ambassador Cofer Black, former ambassador at large, coordinator for counterterrorism, U.S. State Department, former director, Central Intelligence Agency, Counter-Terrorist Center. I've had the opportunity to talk to people before the panel, and when I asked them about that pre-9/11 intelligence picture, almost everyone went back to the 90s. When they had that first sort of warning sign. And I'm going to start actually with Gary. Gary said to me that it was really in 1998 that you had that first sense that al-Qaeda would go big.
Well, my first recollection of al-Qaeda, of course, was in the mid-1990s from Mr. Michael Scheuer, who was probably the first person in the agency early on that recognized that this guy was a very serious problem, as coming out of what we called the Afghan Arabs. In 1998, of course, we had the East Africa bombings. I was the chief of Hezbollah operations in CIA's counterterrorism center. I was selected to lead the deployment out there the day the bombs went off. that those embassies were destroyed because we thought it has all the hallmarks of Hezbollah bombing. Hezbollah back in 1983 did multiple car bombs against the U.S. Marine Corps barracks, did the French, and had done a lot of other attacks on us. The most recent significant attacks had been Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. And so this looked like Hezbollah to us, first blush. Cofer's predecessor at that point was Mr. Jeff O'Connell. And before we deployed, Jeff O'Connell said to me, take an al-Qaeda analyst with you. You may find that this is not Hezbollah. And that al-Qaeda analyst would turn out to be very, very useful. We arrived on the ground, very, very rapidly started rounding people up, both in East Africa and even over in Pakistan. The Pakistanis were cooperative. And at that point, coming back from Pakistan with one of the prisoners, that prisoner confessed completely his involvement with al-Qaeda, and I think that was probably the first report that was written that said that al-Qaeda had gone big. They had decided to take the United States on in a very, very serious way, and that was, of course, 7 August 1998.
So that's 1998, and you then told me, Gary, that in the summer of 2001, you were at a meeting of the station chiefs with Cofer Black, and he made a very big impression on you just in terms of his tone and demeanor.
Yeah, well, 3 months before 9/11, it was the spring, it was June of 2001. Cofer came to what we call a chief of station conference. These are all the new chiefs of station. They're getting ready to deploy, and Cofer stood in front of the group of us. There were probably 30 of us there, and said, "Look, there's an attack is coming. I do not know where it is. I need your help. I need every one of you." And he confronted each of us and said, each of you needs to collect the intel. Each of you needs to step out, do what needs to be done to identify this. I see all the signs of a very, very significant attack. When Cofer left the room and we went off to get coffee, 2 or 3 people said, "Oh, he's got his hair on fire." Part of the problem was convincing our own people at that point. That was half the battle, trying to convince our own people. Some of those chiefs of station did not believe him. I believed him. I've been in CTC for a number of years. I've been working the CT target for years and saw it as my number one priority.
So, Cofer, I asked you about that meeting, and you explained to me that there were really 4 or 5 elements which made it, in your opinion, virtually impossible to get people's attention during that period. They were issues of size and scale and just not having that tactical detail to reverse the inertia.
Well, first of all, I don't remember this meeting. Second of all, that's either really bad, or I prefer to say that we were doing this so much it sort of blurs. Yeah. This has been a great conference. A lot of the speakers refer to the improvements in the last couple of years, Admiral Olson and the like. We really need to remember, as we're talking about history here, I first started doing this as pretty much a full-time job against al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups when I was in Khartoum, Sudan. In 1993, I was on a unaccompanied tour. All we did was counter-terrorism and sleep. That was about it. And it was very productive, and that's what we did. And that's what enabled me to be pretty familiar and knowledgeable about what this threat represents to our country. I moved along from that. We can talk about these things later as you wish. But then when I took over the job as the director of the Counter-Terrorism Center, and in fact, when I inevitably found myself in front of a hearing about a disaster in front of Richard, I made it very clear that when they talk about surprise, there was no surprise. None. Zero. None. In fact, in the first week of briefings, when I came into the Counterterrorism Center, as I told the 9/11 Commission, there was no doubt in my mind I was going to be sitting in front of a congressional hearing, public hearing, explaining how thousands of Americans had died. If not me, then certainly my successor, who also turns out to be here, Jose Rodriguez. So between the two of us, one of us was going to be there. This is the way this thing tracked. But the times were different. You look at all of you people here. Before 9/11, we were concerned about things like, in the media, one of the worst offenders in this, shark attacks.
Yes, that's
anything but what we were interested in. And not only that, it was reflected in our politics. It was reflected in our federal government. As Gary said, it was even, to a certain extent, reflected in the agency. It was very unusual to be a person advancing aggressively that there was an attack coming. And if you do this long enough, there tends to be a sense of, it's just those guys with their hair on fire. So there is that. So you have this process over time that a very small force, and we can talk about this, was
Maybe
able
just tell
to,
people now how small it was to give them that context, and how at that time really Hezbollah was seen as the central terrorist threat.
Yeah. One thing I want to make very clear, I don't reveal secrets. So everything I tell you is reflected in language that's being approved. When I wanted to say this in front of the 9/11 Commission, it was approved, rather than give a number, because that'd be sort of secret. Even to this day, I guess, I don't know, I should check. What I was allowed to say is, in terms of numbers of personnel, we had the equivalent of 2 Army infantry companies. And you in the military, you can do the math. There's not a lot of people. And in terms of money, we had enough money to buy maybe 2 jet fighters. We had, working Al-Qaeda specifically, we had less people working on that than 9/11 Commission had staff, and less money. But this is in its own time. People go, well, they should have known better in hindsight. In its time moving forward, that's where we were coming from. So we had very few people, very little money, but the world was our scope. We rank ordered terrorist groups from number 1, Hezbollah. Why? Because it killed 251 Marines, Gary, 253?
241 Marines.
241 Marines. Number 1. Once you've killed Americans, you claim to kill Americans like that, you're going to be high on the list. They were number 1. Al-Qaeda moved up very quickly to be right below that. We rank all of these groups in different categories. And in fact, I mentioned to Catherine, the poor Japanese Red Army, all 6 of them were pursued by the Central Intelligence Agency like everybody else, but not with the vigor, right? Not with the vigor that would go against Al-Qaeda, because they had shown no desire to hurt Americans. So that's kind of where it was. Not a lot of money, not a lot of people. We're ahead of the curve in terms of warning, but the times were really kind of unreceptive to this type of an alert.
I'd like to bring in Barbara next, and then Richard. I have here what people often refer to as an iconic intelligence product. Does that work for you, Barbara?
All right.
Possibly? Okay.
Yes.
It's called Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the U.S., and if you would give me just a moment, I'd like to read you a few passages from it, because I think it's worth reminding people that this is what was briefed to President Bush in August of 2001. Okay, so about a month before the attack. It's a great document because it's very concise and to the point. It reads in part, clandestine foreign government and media reports indicate bin Laden since 1997 has wanted to conduct terrorist attacks in the U.S. The Millennium Plotting in Canada in 1999 may have been part of bin Laden's first serious attempt to implement a terrorist strike in the U.S. Although bin Laden has not succeeded, his attacks against the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 demonstrate that he prepares operations years in advance and is not deterred by setbacks. Al-Qaeda members, including some who are U.S. citizens, have resided in or traveled to the U.S. for years, and the group apparently maintains a support structure that could aid attacks. We have not been able to corroborate some of the more sensational threat reporting, such as that from Redacted Intelligence Service in 1998, saying that bin Laden wanted to hijack a U.S. aircraft to gain the release of the blind sheikh and other U.S.-held extremists. I think these are the 2 most important paragraphs. Nevertheless, FBI information since that time indicates patterns of suspicious activity in this country consistent with preparations for hijackings and other types of attacks, including recent surveillance of federal buildings in New York City. The FBI is conducting approximately 70 full field investigations throughout the U.S. that it considers bin Laden related. CIA and the FBI are investigating a call to our embassy in the UAE in May, saying that a group of bin Laden supporters was in the U.S. planning attacks with explosives. And Barbara knows this intelligence product better than most. Give us some of the backstory as to preparing this and the kind of details that you had to consider to make this a current intelligence product and not a historical product.
Well, this came out of the unit I was working in, which was a very small unit devoted to Al-Qaeda Central. We had gotten a couple more people, I think, during that summer.
One or two, maybe.
And we were approached by senior managers, would you write something about Al-Qaeda and the United States? It wasn't about a specific threat, but we can't just write something historical. That's not the way these President's Daily Briefs were done. The policymakers, we're generally told, are not interested in history per se. So what were we to say? What was the policy of Al-Qaeda then toward the United States? And all we could say was they want to attack the United States. They had declared war on the United States in 1996 against the U.S. military and followed that up in 1998 with a fatwa saying it was the duty of every Muslim to kill all Americans wherever you find them, civilian and military. And a colleague in the unit came up with a quote from bin Laden, we want to emulate Ramzi Youssef and bring the fighting to America. And in our view at the time, we were still reeling from the millennium plotting period and the amount of information that came in with that, that we thought that was an opening wedge to attack inside the United States. And when you think there's a reference to Ahmed Rassam in that article, that sounds old, that was from 2000. No, it was not. Ahmed Rassam was making a deal with the U.S. government to testify against other conspirators in the millennium plotting, and that was new information in July of 2001. But we have to hook it to something that's going on now. So this particular item was coordinated with the FBI as well. And that's where the information about 70 full field investigations. We have to hook it to what's going on now. So FBI thought there was Al-Qaeda related people in the United States, and so that was included. And we were all getting some sort of a feeling about hijackings. I have to admit, we don't know if it didn't seem to have anything connected to 9/11, but something was out there in the air. And we said, FBI, you seeing something? And they said, yeah, something about hijackings. And something was running through my mind in that unit, which was, I just read something. I can't quite put my finger on it. And I also read the FAA analysis of hijackings that came out a little bit before, and it's mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report. And maybe that was in my mind, and we knew the blind shake threat from 1998. Something clicked to put something about hijacking. Was it enough? No, there was nothing concrete. But that's what we had. That was the vibe, and that was the picture of Al-Qaeda's policy toward the United States.
So, Richard, I want to bring you in now because you have the overview from the position of someone who was part of the 9/11 Commission. So you're seeing all of this intelligence, including this product, bin Laden determined to strike the United States. And what was your assessment when you reviewed all of this intelligence?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Clark Irvin for putting this conference together. I learned a tremendous amount, and I congratulate the Aspen Institute for doing this. On 9/11, I was practicing law. I had been a federal prosecutor. I'd been involved in some national cases. And then after I was appointed to the commission, I was abducted into this world of intelligence. I knew nothing about it, really, although I did have a code word clearance for another project that I had worked on. We didn't get this August 6 PDB until much later, after a great deal of toing and froing with the administration. I sort of likened it to using a blowtorch and a pliers, but eventually Barbara's prescient PDB was released publicly. We talk a lot about stovepiping, but there was stovepiping even within the agencies. And so the things that I focused on later on in analyzing the intelligence that was available that might have, had it been exploited with good luck and happenstance and intelligence, could have interrupted the plot. So one of the things that was known but was not in this PDB, because Barbara and her colleagues didn't know it, was that 2 identified al-Qaeda members were in the United States, al-Hazmi and al-Midhar. This didn't make it into the report. This was another group that had eventually given the information after a tremendous amount of confusion to the FBI a month before the attacks, and it was not followed up on in any kind of remotely robust manner. Had their Hazmi's picture been put on America's Most Wanted, probably the plot would have been delayed. More importantly, I think, was the arrest of Zacarias Moussaoui. Moussaoui was arrested in Minneapolis at a flight school learning to fly a 747. He had no business learning to fly a 747. He had no training, previous training, he had no ability. He had no prospect for a job in the airline industry commercially. He had unexplained cash in his account, and on further investigation, he had jihadist, certainly extremist leanings. The FBI agents who arrested him sent repeated communications to FBI headquarters trying to get the attention of the director of the FBI, senior executives in the FBI, saying, and I'm almost quoting this guy could be training to fly a commercial plane into the World Trade Center. Yet nothing remotely resembling useful action was taken as a result of this. Director Tenet was briefed shortly after the arrest. His briefing said Islamic radical learns to fly. Nothing was done to harden cockpit doors. Nothing was done to make more robust the screening procedures. Just these 2 things. Had the cockpit doors been locked and secured, had the terrorists been deprived of going through the screening facilities with bladed instruments, which were then used to kill and threaten and terrorize the people on the plane and take control of the planes, could this have succeeded? Would they have been arrested after screening? So these are 2 of the main things. Barbara's and her colleagues' August 6 PD was meant, as Barbara told me in our interview, to pull the president's coat. Everybody was considering that the attack would come overseas because that's where they attacked before. But could this, in fact, this preparation that had everyone's hair on fire because they knew it was going to be spectacular, it was going to be directed against American interests, could it happen in the United States? This was essentially ignored. And had the president assembled his cabinet officers, including the Attorney General, to pulse their agencies, to bring to the top all the information that they had, to rethink and reconsider everything they had, Hazmi and Midhar, Moussaoui, that could have come to the fore. And I'll close with, in our last public hearing on the commission, one of the most heartbreaking pieces of information, I think, came from an individual named Ben Sliney, who was one of the heroes at the FAA who got the planes on the ground on 9/11. A tremendous exercise where no one else was lost. And I asked him, what would you have wanted to know that you did not know but was in the possession of our collective intelligence and law enforcement agencies prior to 9/11. And he said, we never knew the terrorists could fly the plane.
I'd like to pick up on a point that Richard made there about the two hijackers, Al-Hazmi and Al-Midar. They're not household names to many people, but they were very important to the plot. They were really the beachhead. They were the first two hijackers that were inside the United States. They arrived in January of 2000. And I took a special interest in them, and I'll just explain why. But a year ago, I interviewed the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, and he told me, Philip Zelikow said, that Al-Hazmi and Al-Midar, there was something that always bothered investigators. They were two experienced operatives, and they were battle-trained, yet they'd never been to the United States, and they spoke no English. Yet, after the Malaysian Summit, where the final sort of pieces of the plot were put into place, they arrive in Southern California and almost immediately go to the ghetto of San Diego, where they connect with someone we spent a lot of time talking about this the last few days, Anwar al-Awlaki. And Philip Zelikow said to me that they felt the hijackers would only have gone there and KSM would only have sent them there if there was in fact someone there to meet them. So I wanted to ask Cofer and Gary to take us through the Malaysian Summit, what the CIA knew about that meeting, who was there, and the hijackers, and how it was that their trail was lost in this handover to the FBI.
This activity took a long period of time. You know, the analogy I would leave you with is that the only time you can get charged with an error in a baseball game is if your team's on the field. We were the team on the field. We identified these guys. We tracked them to the Middle East comprehensively, tracked them to Malaysia, also to Thailand, working with the locals. They were unusual in their behavior patterns.
Unusual in what? In
their behavior
sense?
patterns.
But in what way?
Well, the way they conducted themselves, doing counter-surveillance routes and things like that. We knew that they were meeting people. Most of this was done with our friends overseas, and that basically they had the work order on this. It kept on going, and they moved on to Thailand, I believe it was. And this continuity was interrupted as they got off the plane and stayed there for a while. The onward travel here to the United States was conducted. This information was made available to the FBI overseas. We have people in the FBI working in the Counterterrorism Center. The actual arrival in the United States, their knowledge of their existence, it was the understanding of the people that were reviewed by 9/11. This information had been passed to the FBI. When it was looked into later, as we were looking at these threats, remember, we're very concerned what attack sets could be coming. Again, this material was looked at. It was identified that these people had come into the United States after months. This information was immediately checked, was immediately passed to the FBI. The FBI had this information in the middle of August for their follow-up before September the 11th. So from a management standpoint, it had a lot to do with the field, had to do with headquarters personnel, along with all the other work orders that we had and all the people that we were tracking. I will tell you that when these guys were going through the Far East, they did not look any more unusual than other similar type groups that we were tracking.
Gary?
At the same time, this is not sort of just a static process. CIA had been sending teams into Afghanistan. During the war, of course, we refer to the team Jawbreaker, the team that I was leading, but there were Jawbreaker missions from '98 onward. And so there were teams that were being sent in by CTC to be on the ground to help track Al-Qaeda in an effort to do captures, major captures. I was on the last team in March of 2000, on the ground, on the front with the Northern Alliance on the Shomali Plains at night, working with them, assisting them. So it's not just passively collecting intel; it's conducting fairly risky missions as well. To put all of this in context.
And why did those missions start in '98? What was the catalyst?
The irony behind, just give you my background on this, is that I don't know that these missions are even taking place. I'm running Hezbollah operations.
Right.
In 2000, I'm getting ready to actually help the agency open the back door. I'm going to go into Tajikistan and open the door for additional operations there that Cofer is trying to run inside of Afghanistan. And I'm doing advanced review of Persian. I get a phone call one day and they said, come into the office, we need to talk to you. I walk in, they say, we have a team going into Afghanistan this afternoon. The only linguist on the team can't go. Can you go? You'll be gone for a couple of months. I said, okay. This is not good for a marriage, by the way, gentlemen. And so I found out about the agencies, this was all compartmented operations. I find out about it that day. I kind of felt like the Forrest Gump of counterterrorism, and so on the team I go and into Afghanistan. So, that mission was useful for me because I got to meet many of the key Afghan warlords that I would use later during the 2001 entry for the war. But there's a lot going on, not just that collection.
I just want to follow up on the two hijackers with you, Richard. Is that your assessment, too, that everything was done to pass along that information in this handover between the CIA and the FBI?
Well, I think there was a stumble, if not a fumble, in the handover because of the authorities of the people involved in this dividing line between domestic and foreign intelligence gathering, and how that, it's a complicated story. It's all in the 9/11 Commission report, as is the information about al-Awlaki and the other individuals with whom the terrorists met while they were in the United States. Al-Awlaki is singular in that he was both on the West Coast and then turns up on the East Coast, beyond coincidence, I think, in our view, but we laid the facts out as they were. So these are things which are only found out later. Without when the question is put, could the plot have been interrupted? Yes, it could have been interrupted. The question is, were we lucky? Al-Qaeda made mistakes. They had this a person who was a fairly unstable individual, Moussaoui, come. Not the 20th hijacker, I want to add. The 20th hijacker was somebody else, Mohammed al-Qahtani, who was eventually arrested in Afghanistan and unfortunately will never be brought to trial because of the interrogation methods employed against him. But Moussaoui, I think, provided the key if it had been exploited. Here was someone who had clear radical chops, an avowed Muslim extremist, and what did that tell us? It told us, hey, with all this going on, with the spectacular attack that's coming, maybe we ought to do more in terms of airline security. The idea of planes being used as guided missiles was not, as our former national security advisor said, something that could not be imagined. It was something that was imagined and, in fact, had been gamed in exercises. And, in fact, in the recent summit, there was an air cap over Italian cities where the leaders of the free world were meeting exactly to protect against the possibility of suicide air attack. So it's not something that we didn't know about. It's nothing that we couldn't have thought about. It was just not stitched together in time.
So, Barbara,
I would just
yeah, sure, please.
If we had FBI special agent here, and I'd ask them, I'd say, so what happened? And he'd say, well, to access this guy's computers, what we needed was against their rules and regulations. This is actually quite a complex story. I don't want anyone thinking here this is pretty, see Fred run. This is really complicated, and you should read the 9/11 report. It gives you a sense about who's where doing what. And so it is a very complex system. But it was set up by man. It was set up by Americans to follow the rule of law and to protect.
Right.
This is a very clear point. So I think under the times, I think proceeded mindfully. There are things in hindsight one wishes that they could do, but I do think that if you look at the times, shark attacks, resources allocated, people working full tilt to do this, the rules and regulations, the passing information, the wall from the Bureau, one thing and the other. I think it's a complex story that should be validated as such, and not being simple.
And just to follow up on Cofer's point, there's a human element in all of this. There was a misinterpretation of the regulations with respect to seeking to search Moussawi's computer, which would have led, as it did ultimately, to bin al-Shib, who was intricately involved in the plot as one of the principal organizers and paymasters. But there was also a federal judge who I don't know if Fran Townsend's in the room, but who beat the crap out of prosecutors and FBI agents over the way they were applying the regs, and then they backed off. They would not come up to the line in the Moussawi case because they'd gotten slapped around. So there are all kinds of things that could have been different, and this could have turned out differently had we been lucky.
Barbara, please.
Yes, I'd like to make a point about analytic problems in the sense of when we're talking about all these things, it seems very easy that we could have connected dots. But studies, social science studies of the way people forecast things shows you that we cannot go back now to analyze what we did wrong with full clarity, because hindsight bias is inescapable. Even if you try to put yourself in the exact position you were then, you cannot do it according to these theories. Now, I don't do these analyses myself, but that's what the community of psychologists and people who study analysis are saying. So it's very difficult. Would we have picked up on every point? When you look at what was coming at us that year, the 9/11 Commission report mentions that before 9/11, during the year 2001, 40 President's Daily Briefs were written. Almost all of those would have been done by the small unit I was in, with a few exceptions. And there were other levels of product that went to other officials in the government. And there was reporting. I would take exception with Jane Harman's statement that was bad intelligence, although I briefly crossed my mind, did she mean analysis? Because I wanted to defend myself right there. There was a tremendous amount of information coming in. There was a tremendous amount of work on collection. There was a tremendous amount of effort at analysis. We had information we were following threats in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Europe, you name it. We had reporting on it. What was important? Was it going to be hijackings? Was it going to be an armed attack? Was it going to be a huge bomb? What were we to look at? All of those things had precedent. And that's the warning for today, because we have even more of that. Every single, well, it can't be because you're still imaginative scenarios, because the enemy is always looking for something different. But we have a precedent now for almost every type of threat. What do you make important? And when we're looking at the hijacking issue and looking at Moussawi and the like, when did that material come out? August. How long does it take to gear up, to get all of those elements in place, to send someone to look at this, to send someone to look at that, to coordinate with the FBI, to have a meeting, have a video conference, let's do this, let's do that, but what about this threat? The Middle East people are following this, the South Asia people are following this. Any one of those could have been important. We were worried about the United States, of course, but we had the Millennium Plotting, we didn't have the concrete threat yet I mean, people were following Mihdhar and such.
I just want to ask a couple more questions before we open it up to questions. For you, I think an obvious question I have, and I've heard from others, is whether we really got the full story of 9/11. And I'm referring specifically to these 28 pages in the Joint Congressional Inquiry that were never declassified, that have to do with the Saudi contacts, because there are now calls on Capitol Hill to reconvene the 9/11 Commission, to assess the progress that we've made, and to almost have maybe a historical revision of what we now know. So I'll actually just start with Gary and maybe work down the line.
Well, in terms of Saudi Arabia, people have to remember that bin Laden, during his first incarnation during the jihad period against the Soviets, had worked with large numbers of Saudis and others, and he helped resettle many people after the conflict was over. He helped resettle hundreds of people back into Saudi Arabia. There's a class of middle-class businessmen there who were formerly jihadists that were loyal to him. He had a significant, significant infrastructure on the ground in that country. Aside from government contacts, this is a man that had used his wealth for purposes of jihad and purposes of building his larger organization, Al Qaeda, and had access to funds, people, support, and those things reached out beyond that part of the world. I spent time in Albania, and he had people there that were planning to attack the embassy. So this was, as Cofer stated, this was not simple stuff. This was enormously complicated. There were people all over the place, and we were hunting these guys with very little rest. We were on them constantly, but there were so many of them in so many places, and it was very, very complicated by the places we were having to work in.
Whereas it was also very difficult, I think, to sensitize American leadership to this. It was also, they were actually farther ahead than the vast majority of our friends overseas. I spent a lot of time getting on planes, going to every continent in the world, trying to get our colleagues to have the will and capacity to operate against Al Qaeda. There was a commonality of threads. I mean, if you to this, and we'll get to Saudi Arabia in a minute. I mean, you go in the Middle East, it was basically, listen, we know what we're doing here. We'll get everything under control. In Europe, Cold War's over, the wall's down, no more Soviet Union, we're fine and dandy. It was very difficult to convince our partners overseas that this was coming, including Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia portrayed itself as being pretty confident of its security, that it was pretty much in control and knowledgeable. And the question, I think, in hindsight is that true, or was there a little bit of self-deception in this? But I don't know what this document would say, but my suspicion personally would be it'd be a reflection of perhaps inaccurate or incomplete information on the time. I'm not one really to believe in too many conspiracies. It's usually there's another very good reason for it.
Richard?
Well, I would fully support the declassification of the document. These 28 pages are not going to blow the lid off some enormous conspiracy or secret. I really don't see any reason why it should remain classified. The 9/11 Commission did its best to report the facts, what we knew. There was no secret that bin Laden sought and received substantial financial support from elements in Saudi Arabia. Did that come from the core Saudi royal family? I don't think so. We didn't find any evidence to suggest that any of the 7 Saderi brothers, for example, from the king down, supported bin Laden financially. But clearly, because of the mere size of the Saudi royalty, there probably were individuals who had titles of prince, and certainly businessmen who were extremely wealthy and sheikhs who made contributions. The bargain between bin Laden and Saudi Arabia, explicit or not, Stay out of Saudi Arabia. Don't cause any trouble here, and we're not going to be too eager to shut you down, I think is laid out in the 9/11 Commission report. So I doubt that there are any facts. There may be some interpretation in that document, but I doubt that there are any facts that have not yet been reported.
Barbara?
Well, I don't have anything specific on that issue. I haven't seen any surprises over the years as far as information goes. I mean, you always, as Richard just said, we always knew there were people supporting bin Laden there. Who they were and you know, and to what degree always had to be studied. But the thing that might be a problem just theoretically with releasing the report would be that there's so much more known now that what was known then was so little compared to what's known now. So people wouldn't understand necessarily what's been developed since.
And the paradigm has shifted
Right.
Significantly after bin Laden attacked within Saudi Arabia. Suddenly the Saudis became much more agreeable to cooperate with us. Not surprising. Cooperation in that regard has been far more robust and substantial. So as a historical document, this is something in the nature of interest, maybe a relic, maybe certainly its due date may be expired by this time. But again, this only foments conspiracy theories, and there are no shortage of those. This is still another one. And again, like the August 6 PDB, which the declassification of which was resisted, the sky would fall, the end of the world would come if this were made public. In fact, once you see it, there are a couple of redactions that are insignificant. There was no real problem. Often, classification hides things that are embarrassing or show lack of competence. Clearly, real secrets should be protected, but I'm not one to suggest that there is not a tremendous amount of unnecessary overclassification of documents.
And a final question before I open it up. Anwar al-Awlaki, who we've been spending a lot of time talking about at this conference, one of the issues that the 9/11 Commission report raises in a nutshell is whether they were seriously considering whether he was part of a support cell within the United States to facilitate the hijackers. When al-Hazmi and al-Midar arrive on the West Coast, they pretty much make a beeline for San Diego. And as I said, this is really, I've been there, the ghetto. In those days, it was, hookers and check cashing places. It was really hiding in plain sight. And they developed this relationship with the cleric. His sort of go-to guy in San Diego was a Yemeni called Modar Abdullah, who helped them find a place to live and jobs at a gas station and IDs and all of these things. And then virtually an identical situation unfolds in Virginia when Awlaki moves to the mosque there. Hazmi and then Hanjour show up at the mosque, and shortly thereafter, one of Awlaki's helpers, sort of like the Yemeni, this time a Jordanian, mirrors the same behavior, helps them find a place to live, jobs, all of the rest of it. And in short order, drives the two hijackers with two others who've just recently arrived. This is the summer of 2001. And they're muscle hijackers. Drives them on eventually to Connecticut, and they settle in Paterson, New Jersey. And by May, June 2001, 7 of the hijackers are now living in a one-bedroom apartment, have some kind of connection, somewhat removed, but to the cleric. And one of the questions I'd like to hear your thoughts on is whether there was, in fact, some sort of support network within the United States that allowed the hijackers to stay under the radar, or whether it was simply 4 teams of foreigners who were able to do that themselves.
Well, I mean, I think there were contacts. The two fellows in San Diego stayed with a fellow that I believe was a FBI.
That's correct,
source.
an FBI informant.
I think that this operation had been underway, planning actually when I came to the Counter-Terrorism Center. Started. So summer of 1999 is when this thing was approved and went forward. I don't know of any firm, hard, inserted operational support personnel. I think they used the people that were supportive of them, and I think we have reason to believe that. But I think this operation was pretty tenuous. The interruption of one pilot slowed down the operation. I believe, or recall, it was meant to take place in August. They had to wait till September. So I don't think and I would not say this with complete confidence, but my understanding is that they used the resources that were available to them at the time, that they did not have a lot of pre-implanted infrastructure directly supporting this activity. I think they saw the United States to be sufficiently lacking in defenses once they got in, that they were pretty much, had pretty much free reign. I mean, look at illegal immigrants and the like, and once you get in the country, you're pretty much set. So I think that was their view of it.
Gary, I see you.
I agree completely. I wouldn't add anything else.
I think the individuals we've talked about were enablers. They obviously had connections back into the community. They were thought to be trusted individuals. Whether they had any operational knowledge of the 9/11 plot is entirely speculative, and we have not seen any direct evidence of that.
To show you how the analysis situation changed, that became a very specialized topic within our unit. People studied the actual attack scenario, but I was in a different, following the next threat. So I didn't have a chance to get into that. But over the years, what I've just thought was that was it. They must have had colleagues there, but those people didn't know what the plot was about.
Let me amend it to say, lest you think of me as totally naive, that somebody like al-Awlaki could not conceivably have believed that these people were here as tourists, or here just to have a good time and to go to go-go bars and to eat, and to eat well and to enjoy Disneyland or whatever. Quite clearly, he knew or had reason to believe, any, I think, reasonably thinking person would conclude that they were here to do harm.
So let's open up for questions. Yep, right there in the back. I think it's Sean Waterman. Yep.
Sean Waterman from the Washington Times. Gary, and perhaps Ambassador Black, could you say a little bit about why the US made various attempts after 1998 to kill bin Laden. Why didn't they work? Why weren't they successful? And also, Ambassador Black, you talked about the Saudis. Did they turn after 9/11, or was it after May 2003 when Al-Qaeda blew up the Ministry of the Interior there?
Let me say one thing.
In that year and a half, were they fully on board, or?
First off, there was no effort to kill him after 1998 because we were still operating under Executive Order 1233, which prohibited the agency doing anything like that. So, there were efforts, there were plans that were put together by the Al-Qaeda shop, which was run by various people during that period of time, to do captures of bin Laden, but no effort to kill him at that point. I was involved in a single effort in Afghanistan to try to capture, either Zawahiri or Atef in 2000. We were unable to do it, but killing them was not on the table, not until after 2001.
I speak to that too. There's a sort of the media debate about killing Osama bin Laden. If there was, nobody told me. Our mission was to capture. Now, in a delicate situation, you could see scenarios where a guy is protected with between 40 and 60 guys with machine guns. It get kind of dicey. But the approach that was developed under the rules and regulations of this country was to capture him, and that was what we did. That was what our focus was on until after September 11, 2001, and then the game changed.
Well, I think reading the 9/11 Commission report, you might get a slightly more nuanced picture of the capture authority, which then I think quite explicitly in the President's directive included kill or capture. This was so
About
closely...
after 2001 or before?
Before 2001.
Let me go into that.
Go read the report, Gary.
Yep. I know the orders that we were given on the ground when we deployed.
Okay, well, here you go. Welcome to the government. First of all, there are a lot of lawyers involved in this. One. Two, we must have had an army of lawyers just working on this. Yeah. At the time and after the fact, our lawyers did an assessment. Did we have approval to do this? Conclusion is no. And if there was at the time, we certainly did not operate under that type of view.
Well, it was so closely held. Clearly, there was no appetite to be, even for the use of drones once they became operational.
Well, that would be speculative.
The ones, no, this was the ones that we talk about as the discussion between the CIA and DOD about who would actually pull the trigger. But with respect to killing bin Laden, there was a cruise missile attack. I mean, that was not a capture operation. And there was a cruise missile attack that very nearly nailed him.
That was the Department of Defense, so that was not the CIA.
Excuse me.
Well, there's a big difference. We have no cruise missiles. We're talking about direction that comes to us. It was capture. We'd like some, but we didn't have that.
Look, after 2001, it became very clear because I came back, was brought into a room with the lawyers. They read me the thing. They said, go out and kill him at that point. And then in 2001, we took the gloves off, and it was a very different game. And it was real clear at that point what we could do. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, there was an instance where we had officers out in Afghanistan who shared information with the Northern Alliance, who then conduct artillery strikes in Al-Qaeda, and you'd have thought that they had committed some horrible crime.
Let me tell you what would happen, and if indeed we had done that. Obviously, there's a difference between a capture operation and killing somebody. We can kind of agree on that, one being a lot easier than the other. Look at the D.C. shooter in D.C., okay? If we had done that, if we had gone forward to kill, it would have been a felony. We could be charged with murder. So trust me, this is not something that we were engaged in. We did not have authority to do it. Simple.
I encourage you all to read the report.
Kimberly over here.
Thanks. Kim Dozier with the AP. I'd like to ask you guys to use your years tracking Al-Qaeda and look forward. We've heard at this conference from several of the speakers that take out the top 3 to 5 leaders, Doug Lutz said today, and that could be a knockout punch. Admiral Olson said something similar. From what you know of studying them, tracking their networks, how fast do they reconstitute? Can you really deliver a knockout punch?
Barbara's going to begin.
Okay, well, I can say that from what I'm seeing now, they are extremely weak. However, I would never sell them short. They have always had a system of replacing people that were killed. They don't necessarily constitute like a military unit in the U.S. military or anything, but like any other group, when your leader is killed, somebody else steps up to the plate. And they want to do that, and they have it part of their bylaws to do that. There were documents found after 2001, even before, showing that. So you can't sell them short, and you can say, well, their bench is small now. You don't even know who all these people are necessarily. Someone could be there who maybe had a lesser role, low profile before, but actually is an experienced person. Or it's a less experienced person in that particular field, but brings some skills to the table. So you can't necessarily rule it out. But it doesn't look too good for them at Al-Qaeda Central, as long as the pressure stays on them. I mean, Zawahiri can pull it together. He can do it for a while. But if you're going after him too, if you're going after his subordinates too, all at the same time, and it keeps it up, then maybe you can deal a knockout to that central command. You'll still have people around. You'll still have sympathizers. Not only sympathizers, you'll have people who were members of the group. But to get it reorganized would take some time. You've still got, of course, their affiliates, like AQAP that's been mentioned several times. I wouldn't sell them short either. And as was pointed out in the discussion by the Middle East ambassadors, and that's going to be hard to keep up the kind of pressure you need in Yemen to keep that group from sticking around and finding ways of operating.
Anyone else like to weigh in on that?
I think they've made tremendous progress. I mean, the military intelligence people have been doing this. I think it's a real success story. It transferred from one administration to the other, from one generation of intelligence officer to the other, and military personnel. Great progress has been made. A couple things are of concern. One is this is all validated and true, but if they slip off an attack and Americans die, then we all will talking about how there's a hole in the sieve and we weren't as successful as we thought we were. One. Two, I was in North Carolina when this most unfortunate attack happened in Norway. And the first message I got was, hey, there's a terrible attack, children's murder, and a terrorist group in the Middle East claimed responsibility for it. So you have that effect too. I think rather than just all-out attacks, I think we've shifted to a mode of where it's the narrative and perceptions. These guys still have a lot of punch left in them if they can portray themselves as conducting successful attacks.
I think we probably just have time for one more question. John.
Yeah, John Pistol, and obviously a career FBI agent, and had the opportunity to testify 3 times before the 9/11 Commission, and I appreciate the efforts of the panel to really distill a very complex set of facts and circumstances into an hour, slightly more than an hour. The context, I think, is very important, and several have talked about that. But Richard, most specifically, in terms of the information sharing that was not necessarily encouraged, but actively discouraged, not only between the FBI and CIA, but within the FBI, for example, between the criminal investigators and those handling what was considered foreign intelligence. And so some of those challenges and missed opportunities that have been touched upon are both accurate, but the subtleties and nuances within that context, it's very hard to address in such a short amount of time. So I applaud the panel for trying to hit the highlights on that. And again, for anybody who has not read the Commission report, highly, highly recommend it. So thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to add one
Sure,
thing. There were problems, of course, because of the wall. But on an operational side, we had, I'm running Hezbollah. I've got an FBI deputy. The Hezbollah chief down at the FBI's got a deputy that's a CIA guy. We had cross-fertilized in the 1990s. There was a lot of talk going on. All this discussion that there was no talk is nonsense. There were people embedded in one another's organizations, and actually an FBI officer who was one of my deputies had releasing authority in CIA. He could release any intel that he had to the Bureau without even asking me.
Right, but unfortunately there were at least 2 documents that the release authorities was not granted.
Right, but I'm just talking about
as it relates to 9/11.
This I'm talking about in Hezbollah operations.
Sure.
Yeah, different ops
great.
groups ran these
It
differently.
relates to Hazmi. So thank you.
Thank you, though.
For that, John. Look, the 9/11 Commission, we recognized we had a limited amount of time, limited resources. We didn't have full cooperation. As Lee Hamilton said, our report is perhaps the first draft of history. No one could be so arrogant to believe that more facts won't come out over time. More will. And we raised questions on the fact side that we hoped would be answered. Some are being answered. But the main effort was to conduct a full, robust, and credible inquiry into the facts so that we and the public and the Congress and the executive could understand what problems there were that needed to be fixed. And then the second piece of our job was to make recommendations to try to fix what was wrong. Now, many of those recommendations have been implemented, others not so much. I'm not here to say that they were all correct. They didn't come down in commandment form. They came down as our best efforts. And so as we move forward as a nation, I think we are much better integrated. We're better connected. We recognize we're the same team and that there is an impetus to share rather than husband information. And that's the takeaway from this. And I think we've done a great deal to improve our security as a result of the changes that have been made since 9/11.
Thank you for the questions, Gary, Cofer, Richard, and Barbara. Thank you for the honor of moderating the panel. If I could have the liberty of just leaving you with a final idea, and it's sort of come to me many times over the last few days, and it was a piece of advice I was given years ago when I first started reporting on terrorism as a radio reporter for ABC during the IRA's mainland bombing campaign. And I came to know an Iraqi weapons inspector. He was a British Ministry of Defense guy. And he used to always joke to me, Saddam Hussein accuses us of being spies, and of course we are. But he said to me, more seriously, that terrorism is like water and it takes the path of least resistance. And you're dealing with a thinking enemy. You move one way, and it moves another. And I've thought of his summary many times over the last few days, and also in talking to this panel about how the picture has really changed in the last decade. And I've found those words of advice helpful, and I hope you will too. Thank you.
Just a reminder, those going over to Ms. Harmon's home, the vans will pick you up just to the left of door hosier when you leave the front doors. Thank you.